Well, we're in that magic time slot where I'm the only thing between you and barley-based beverages. Not a great place to be, but thank you for staying. Thank you for being here. Jefferson and I have lots to talk to you about, lots that we want to show you. And we want to paint you a bit of a picture. Quite frankly, some of the technologies we're going to talk about already exist. There's many companies here in southern Alberta that are actually leading the way on some of these platforms and some of these technologies. But I think the picture that Jefferson paints, and hopefully will explain to you in some detail, is exactly how those things are coming together. We're at a very interesting time where these technologies are combining in unexpected ways, and I think there's lots of implications for agriculture. As Melody prompted me to say, here she is sitting at the back there, this is actually all about total world domination, right? We have the ability in southern Alberta to feed the world, quite literally. We have the brand reputation in Canada. We're seen as a very high quality, food safe place to obtain crops from. We have the ability to process those. We have R&D capacity here in southern Alberta. There is no reason we truly can't dominate industries and feed the world from here. And if we get involved and engaged in these technologies early and adopt these things, we have the opportunity to truly drive that. And so that's really why I'm interested in this topic, why we're here today. And hopefully we'll drag you along and make it somewhat interesting to you as well. So I want you to think about your morning out in the fields, and I want you to imagine that you've, like this gentleman, you've perhaps hopefully had your morning coffee, you've grabbed your iPad, and all of your farm automation reports are just starting to roll in. Many of you are probably familiar with the suite of programs that are offered by companies like Farmer's Edge as an example, but we're talking about how these things come together with other technologies. So like this gentleman, you've received the latest reports, and in real time, your weather application has updated the forecast for the rest of the week. It's taken that information, figured out what you've already applied through your irrigation system. It's added a new program for your approval. So all you have to do is hit the green button and say, yes, this is what I want to have happen today. It's made dynamic changes to what you had planned for your irrigation for the week. It's actually leveraging real-time data sensors that are in the field, measuring real-time conditions in the soil as of that moment, but trying to give you predictive analytics. It's trying to tell you what could happen over the course of the week based on the forecast, and every morning you're going to get an update as to what that could look like, what changes need to be made to your irrigation plan, and you can do that all with the flick of a button. Now, it's never that simple, right? Because pipes break, people don't show up to work. But imagine the amount of decision-making information you could have if some of these platforms existed and they worked well. So building on that, recent drone surveillance footage over your fields. This one's a bit of an ugly one. But imagine if your drone surveillance comes back and tells you about a pest infestation. Okay, well that technology exists today. But in the meantime, that drone has interpreted the schematics based on its database. It actually knows what pest you're dealing with. And it's provided with you a report that says, by the way, I think you should order this pesticide in this amount. I've already ordered it from the supplier. All you need to do is approve the purchase order. Imagine if that predictive analytical kind of information could come to you to make an informed decision and do that in a quick way. All you have to do is confirm the order. Now, based on the labor hours that your harvest has taken so far this week, the system has also kind of figured out what automated tractors need to be deployed to the field. Again, these technologies already exist, but in the meantime, it's also figured out that you need a little bit more manual labor, and it's texted your employees their work schedule for the rest of the week. Again, all subject to verification by you. That uploads automatically into your payroll system, right? And because it's done through a blockchain, it's immutable, it can't be altered. You're guaranteed to have accurate information. Now, I come from the food business, so I worked for PepsiCo for 15 years. So from time to time, there were often food recall kinds of concerns in our business, as are with most other consumer packaged goods companies. And more consumers want to know where their food is coming from. More and more consumers want to know what field it came from. And more consumers want to know exactly what was applied to that field. That's literally, in many parts of Europe and even some consumer packaged goods companies here, the kinds of information the consumer packaged goods companies are being asked to provide to their commercial customers, to the Walmarts of the world. They need to have that ability to dial all the way back through their supply chain. So imagine this scenario where your food quality system, your on-farm management system, has already been notified by the customer of a food recall concern. They don't think it was you, they think it's actually an ingredient somewhere in the process, but just to make sure, they've requested your harvest records, they've requested your pesticide logs, and as that's been culled by your system automatically, it's already emailed the report back to the customer. So they can compile that information, deal with government inspections, and know where they stand. And again, because it's supported through blockchain technologies, your customers know that they can trust that information, they know what's happening. Now, all of these technologies that I've just mentioned exist. They're all being used today. Many of you are using them here. In southern Alberta, we have a couple of leaders already in that space. Farmers Edge, I mentioned, they have a fairly large operation here in Lethbridge. Although they're based in Winnipeg, they have a pretty significant coding and development center here where they're building some of that software. Planet Labs bought Blackbridge, right? So one of the largest geospatial companies. Planet now has enough satellites deployed around the Earth that they image the entire surface of the Earth every 24 hours. Just imagine that for a moment. The entire surface of the Earth is imaged. We capture high-resolution photography of the entire planet every 24 hours. And a lot of that information is downloaded to and stored here in Lethbridge at Planet's operation in North Lethbridge. So we have companies that are leading the way. Another company here in Lethbridge, Great Excavations, their motto is, we make equipment that floats, essentially. They do large amphibious equipment, particularly for the oil and gas industry, but they're working on automation and controls for retrofitting equipment that doesn't come with it factory installed. So they're experimenting with very large equipment, and how do you make that autonomous, even though it was never designed to be? That work is happening here in Lethbridge. So again, we have all of these players that are doing their thing. A lot of bits and pieces of this system already exist. It comes down more to, how do we bring this together? And what do all these crazy buzzwords like blockchain actually mean? Now, the interesting thing to me when we were talking about this, and I don't know if you can see these cartoons, but the one on the left was published in 1931. So not quite 100 years ago, that picture shows a farmer in a suit, and he's sitting at a big screen TV, much bigger than existed at the time, making controls to his automated equipment in the field. And the copy, that particular advertisement, talks about the fact that science is making such astonishing progress in all of its advanced branches, the above pictorial prediction may not be so far afield in which farming operations will actually be conducted 100 years hence. I would argue much of what that cartoon in 1931 said would be here in 2031, the elements we have already here today. So these are things we've been talking about as an industry for a very long time. So, can we ever replace human intuition? Can we ever replace human know-how? Can we ever replace your experience? The answer is no. I don't necessarily believe that. But we can certainly make more informed decisions with accurate information. We can certainly have better options when we have prediction models that tell us what's happening and give us insights that maybe we're not aware of. Because let's face it, your average day looks more like this. Right? Right up to the axles, right up to the neck, in the mud. So this is still going to happen because even autonomous tractors are likely to have sometimes hit the wrong spot in the field. But the key question for us is how do we make use of these technologies? And to Melody's point, how do we dominate? How do we take advantage of this sooner rather than later? Because a lot of areas of the world are already embracing these concepts and are much further ahead of us. So we have an opportunity to catch up and, in my mind, dominate. Now, if you're like my kids, this phrase comes to mind a lot in my house sometimes, right? This may not be that exciting to you. You're more focused on the latest and greatest. I mean, some of the booths in the back there, we've got some amazing vendors here. But, you know, why it matters to me is all I can tell you. And that's really around this circle. So in Lethbridge, this might be a little hard to read at the back, but the top of that circle, the blue bar is non-commercial services. That's the largest part of our economy here in the city, and that's things like the university and the college. But the next biggest bar is primary and utilities, which is all of you folks. That's agriculture, right? So agriculture represents about 15% of the city's total GDP. The total economic output of Lethbridge, 15% of that is agriculture. It's the second biggest chunk of that pie. But when you look at the rest of the list, things like finance, insurance, real estate, manufacturing, most of those sectors also serve the ag sector. So when you do the math, agriculture is actually more than half of the city's economy. So the city itself relies heavily on primary agriculture. So for me, as an economic developer, anything we can do to grow that pie matters. Anything we can do to get more share in southern Alberta matters. And if these technologies will enable that, then that's a conversation worth having. Now, the bad news is I know almost nothing about blockchain. However, we're fortunate to have Jefferson here with us today, so I'm going to invite him on up to join me on stage here. We've got a couple of scenarios we'd like to run past you. As it says, Jefferson's been involved in a number of different ventures, and I'm going to get him just to give a very quick introduction to himself, and even perhaps one small story. He can't disclose the country he was in, but he's worked on some very interesting things. So Jefferson, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, first of all, how many people here are from Taber? Hometown, right here, so one guy. So the story that Trevor's referring to, I was working in the Middle East, and we were basically, a group of us came together and we were trying to solve some issues for one of the governments, and one of the big issues they have over there is radicalization amongst their populations. And one of my academic friends had created a matrix where he could track how people radicalize in those different areas. And so we used a technology called digital fingerprinting. How many people in the audience have a tablet, a cell phone, and a laptop? Okay, so when you use those and you move from one to the other, within about an 80% confidence rating, I could tell you that that's you moving from tablet to phone to laptop. And I could track what websites you're on from each one of those. In this country, there just wasn't a lot of privacy. And what we started doing, and we were developing a concept and building it out. And essentially what it came down to is we could track people within geo-proximity of each other. We could label people as highly radicalized, and if they were within a geolocation or within a proximity of each other, we would put little ticks up on them from a digital aspect, and we could recognize basically how radicalized they were being. We actually ended up backing out of that project for ethical reasons, but a lot of us, we see these conspiracy or these wild things on TV or these movies, and really those technologies exist today, and just be glad we live in Canada where there are privacy laws.
So you're Big Brother and we should all be concerned, is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't say I'm Big Brother, but okay. There's a lot of Big Brothers out there.
So that's interesting that some of these technologies and geolocation, finding things by satellite, but how does that relate to this audience here today?
Well, there's a lot of technologies. One of the big things I talk about is convergence of technologies, and I'll give a quick example. I was driving between Lethbridge and Coaldale, decided I wanted a new album, music to listen to in the car. I just got on Apple iTunes, scanned my thumb, paid for it, and it downloaded immediately on the LTE network, and I started listening to it within 2 minutes of actually initiating the transaction. That's completely something that's been the convergence of multiple technologies. One of those technologies in and of itself wouldn't have actually been able to provide that end consumer experience for me, but when they all came together, so we're talking digital audio, the digitization and the speed, we're talking about LTE networks, cellular towers, iTunes, all of those things kind of coming together to make that happen. And with this audience, when you're talking about all these little sensors that you're having, your tractor systems, combines, they're all kind of talking to one another, and we're starting to create this really big ecosystem of connected devices, and we'll get a little bit more into that later.
Okay. I mean, one thing that always comes up inevitably in a conversation about technology, and specifically blockchain, is, well, you must be talking about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. So can you talk a little bit about why blockchain isn't a cryptocurrency and why those are two very different things?
So let me start with this. How many people have heard the term Bitcoin before? How many of you invested prior to December of last year? Anybody? Oh, keep your hands up. How many of you didn't get out before the end of December? Okay, that gentleman over there. Come up here for a second.
Come on up. We have an extra drink ticket for you because we know you'll want to cry into your beer later, so.
I can't replace the loss, but I can at least numb it a little bit.
Thank you, I can drink today.
There you go. So Bitcoin kind of came out of nowhere. We actually don't know who created it. The name of the group or people or person is Satoshi Nakamoto. They brought it forward, and blockchain essentially was the platform that enabled Bitcoin to become what it was. What they didn't predict is how much more blockchain would become valuable to the world over Bitcoin. When you get into cryptocurrencies, I'm not really fanatical about them. I think they have a place. I don't know if they have longevity. But blockchain is a much more radical, incredible innovator that will change multiple industries across sector.
Okay, so at a very high level then, can you give us a bit of a sense of the kind of work you're doing around blockchain? Like what are some of the applications for blockchain before we talk about ag specifically?
So applications for blockchain, without getting too far into some of our conversation, essentially blockchain allows you to keep all of your data, allow it to be transparent. Other people can view it when you want them to view it. I'll give this example. In the medical system, Alberta Health Services, essentially when you go to the doctor, they have all your data. Why do they have your data? Why don't you own your own data? Blockchain would allow you to own your own data, maintain it, and give access to the doctor, because really they shouldn't be owning that information. It should be the user. So from an agricultural perspective, there's a lot of data that you would create on your farm if you have everything in place, and that data would be very valuable to you. And that's one of the things, the future is data, and as you create and collect that data, it would allow it to be protected, and we'll get a little bit more, I guess, into that in the next slide.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a second, but one of the other things we hear a lot about is artificial intelligence and the Internet of Things and how that all fits together with blockchain. And Alberta has certainly been recognized as a global leader. There's a pretty significant artificial intelligence sort of cluster in Edmonton. So can you talk a little bit about how those things all come together?
So one of the ways I like to explain it is that these technologies are very much as in the convergence. They're coming together to create some bigger system. I'm going to have a lot of people in the audience. They're going to go, I told you, the future is just going to be a big computer monster and it's going to kill us all and we'll all die by drone. And I don't know if I'm joking by that because I really can't predict the future. But when you look at these, let's take these 4 examples, you have to look at it kind of as the human body or the human system. Artificial intelligence, very much the brain. It's computing and thinking and operating and reasoning. When you get into blockchain, it's more of the memory bank. It sits in the back and it protects everything. And I'm not talking like, my type of memory, because it's not perfect. I'm talking like my 9-year-old son type of memory, where 6 months ago something I promised comes out of nowhere. And he's like, remember 6 months ago you're wearing this shirt, these pants, those shoes, and you promised me these things. That's blockchain. When you get into the Internet of Things, essentially what the Internet of Things is you have all these sensors that are interconnected through the Internet. And as we progress with 5G network, these will become more and more valuable and create a much bigger ecosystem. You have to look at that as kind of the nervous system. So if you think about it from a farm perspective, these Internet of Things sensors would be throughout your farm, and they would be taking potentially moisture analysis, nutrient analysis, and it would be feeding back to the brain, the artificial intelligence, to process that and assist it. When you get into quantum computing, most people have never heard, or the concepts are quite complicated, and quantum would be more like your coffee. It speeds everything up to an accelerated rate. To go into a brief description of quantum computing, essentially what quantum does, it allows one thing to exist in 2 different states at the same time. We are already at a state in our progress in technology where we're expecting the quantum computing to really have a breakthrough in around 2026. And what that will do is we'll take your typical computer and allow it to operate at 100 million times faster than it currently operates. So if you think about these systems as they converge, how easily we can compute, analyze, and break down this data and give it to you in absolute real time.
Okay, so can you maybe give us an example that would have an application to this audience? So where do you see these 4 things fitting together, and maybe kind of walk us through an example or an application perhaps?
So I'll go back to the Internet of Things. So you've got sensors all over your farm. The blockchain simply is collecting all this information and protecting it. It is immutable, and so that phrase essentially is once it's been transacted and completed, no one can go in and hack it, no one can change it or edit it. So your data is your data, and that's one of the most important things, because we have this huge issue in the world where this huge existence of hackers. So as those things kind of continue to feed back to the artificial intelligence, then you'll get the quantum computing that's processing. So you literally, if you had 10,000 acres and had sensors in every single acre, it could be collecting information from environmental factors, weather changes, wind changes, pest changes, and be creating and redeveloping your application systems, redeveloping your irrigation systems, all without you even having really to press a button.
So, if I heard you correctly, it sounds like that we're finally to the point where this technology exists, and we're almost at the point where we'll have the computing power to understand all of that information?
Essentially, yeah. So 2026 is when really things are going to
Okay, so we've got time to prepare.
Estimated.
And what about the cost of all these sensors? Because that, that sounds like an awful lot of equipment that I don't have to buy today.
Essentially, the cost will come down. You get, essentially when we first had the computer, they were the size of rooms in our houses, but cost comes down. So right now we're having a lot of research and development into the Internet of Things, a lot of sensory. We're simplifying them. We're creating really minimal viable products. So these sensors really won't cost an enormous amount, but your return on investment will be so much more because it'll protect you against significant risk mitigation and allow you to make much more in tune, educated decisions on what you're actually going to do.
I know I spend a lot more time than I need to fighting with my Nest thermostat, so I'm really excited about what's coming. Can you maybe talk a little bit, in kind of simple terms, in terms of, blockchain you referenced blockchain kind of underpinning all of this. Maybe explain to us what the elements of blockchain are and kind of help us understand, because it's sort of a nebulous concept that I don't think a lot of people
There's a lot of people that don't, there's a lot of people that will talk on blockchain, and for me, when I started to get and delving into blockchain, I would take a class from Princeton, and then I took my certification, and even at that point, I really had to break things down into more of a simplistic state. So I always go back and I kind of talk about the evolution of our world. You go back to Mesoamerica and you see these tablets where it recorded grain and how much taxes this person paid or that person paid. And they just would have it in a big, long context. Then finally, as you see the progressive history, they started reorganizing the information into columns and rows so that they could look into those things a lot easier. And then we got into the digital world, and for some reason we went a step back and went back to just having a big string of text, and it made it a lot harder for the computer system to go in and find that information. So then we moved into a relational database, which is, again, columns and rows and organizing all of the data. So as we progress there, blockchain really is essentially a complex database system where you can store information. And again, when you get into the immutability, the brilliant part is that you secure that data and nobody can alter it. When you get into certain applications within the finance industry, a lot of transparency opens up. So if farmers are wanting to be more collaborative and sharing information across southern Alberta, we could have essentially a blockchain database that would allow transparency. People would actually be able to see what was going on, and we could all verify it together. And then when you get into faster and less expensive, that's one of the big parts. So to give you an example, the Bank of America, a lot of companies that actually have the biggest risk for blockchain are the ones that are talking the most crap about it, essentially. And the Bank of America were coming out and saying, oh, blockchain's nothing, it won't change anything, it's terrible. And then they filed with the SEC their SWOT analysis, basically what their biggest risks were, and they labeled blockchain as number one. And so it really kicks a lot of the middlemen out of the situation, and because we can track all the information back simultaneously.
Okay. So blockchain then is less of an application or a specific tool and more of a process.
Yeah, it's like the backbone of everything.
Okay.
When you talk about these different types of technologies, those technologies would have worked really good together, but there would have been some trust loss, and that's one of the big things in trustless systems. We talk about this like in the cryptocurrency. The reason why Bitcoin became popular is because they perfected this whole thing of double spending. You couldn't have a digital currency because, I just copy that and I spend it over here, but Bitcoin fixed that. So you couldn't spend the same Bitcoin multiple points from different people. And so the traceability aspects are amazing. And that's one of the big applications towards agriculture industry is being able to trace back.
Okay, well let's talk about that a little bit then. And this audience in particular, traceability, I think is a significant concern. I mean, we've seen that with even recently romaine lettuce, across the U.S., right, as part of food safety concerns. So how would blockchain support traceability for this group?
So it's basically through the supply chain as your product, and what we really like to talk about is we talk farm to table, but we talk seed to table. So we can manage and track a seed from where it gets distributed in the field all the way to harvest to going down in the supply chain to the actual grocer, and then the consumer buys it and they actually could scan a button. So one of the examples I love giving is you get into the industry of wine, and I guess you could really easily compare this to agriculture on here and potatoes and onions and corn and all those types of things is knowing exactly where your products come from. And a better engagement is that there's a trend in the world right now that's moving where people want to know where their products are coming from and they want to be verified, because we have issues in Asia where their products are coming over and they're not what they're labeled as. Well, how do we track that? And so with these tracking systems, we can make an unduplicatable, basically barcode that goes on those things as they go out. We can track it by location as they hit certain points. We can monitor moisture levels in the transport trucks. We can monitor the time that they're spent on the road, spent in waiting to get into the grocery section. So if there's an issue, we can easily trace it back and say, okay, we know that the product was good here and there, and it'll draw it down to this one little point in time, and then we know exactly where that problem is occurring. And sometimes it tracks it all the way back to the field.
And how's that different than sort of some of the manual tracking and processes that exist today? Because I'm quite sure many of our growers in the audience today have production records and harvest records and are required to provide traceability. So how does blockchain make that different than what exists today?
Well, a big part of it, centralization is one of the big problems that we run into in the world, is you have these big corporations who are pulling all this information, they're protecting it, and they don't want to play in the sandbox with anybody else. And so how do you trust those people? So Facebook's a good example. You put your information up there. One of the things they have is when you upload a video, it actually gets uploaded onto multiple servers across the whole world. But they're the ones responsible, and they manage and control all that information. You don't own that data anymore. And so the reason why they decentralize their data but still have a central authority, so an individual, Facebook is basically the guy that says, okay, that's good, that's not, we're going to delete this and leave that. They distribute that so that if one of their database centers gets a tornado and destroyed, then they can, you can still watch your cat video essentially and not worry about that.
The cat videos are important.
They are super important. And so with blockchain is it decentralizes access, and it makes no single person the authority over that information. And so if you're the farmer who had an oil spill and contaminant and you grew stuff on that land anyways, you can't manipulate the data to basically show, oh no, it wasn't me, or some big corporation that doesn't want to be held responsible for the romaine lettuce contamination, for the issues within the supply chain, because those crop up all the time. We see them predominantly more in the United States, but we have them here too.
Okay, so traceability is one key aspect of blockchain, but payments, not that blockchain is the same thing as Bitcoin,
No.
just to be clear, but smart contracts is something that we talk about. So how does blockchain, and again, how would that apply to this group?
You're basically just taking a contract that you've created in the real world and you're digitizing it and putting it up, and then you're setting parameters and conditions that can be automatically triggered upon certain conditions being met. So let's say you had a shipment that was going to a certain location, we could recognize when that shipment hits, and then you can transact. And so if the contract was to say, once your product lands in the shop or the area or the grocery distribution center, the wholesaler, then we'll dispatch, we'll pay you for that automatically. Well, a lot of times now we've got middlemen, we've got brokers, we've got the banks who charge you fees and all these interesting things. With smart contracts, once basically the conditions of that contract have been satisfied and that digital aspect recognizes it, it will immediately dispatch the money to the right person, products transference, and it shows that transference and it records it, and again it becomes permanent. So very much simplified, and it kills those middlemen out of there so that things can be done very quickly.
Okay, interesting. So, I mean, we're fortunate to have you as a business advisor at Tech Connect, so you're accessible to the business community. But if people have more questions about blockchain after today in our Q&A, how do they get help? How do they start looking at some of these technologies and the application?
Good luck. No, I'm kidding. There's lots of information out there, and you got to be careful because there's some people that claim to be, these professionals in blockchain, and they put up some video, and that's another problem that we have within the blockchain sphere is they'll use words that are contextually incorrect. They'll use, the word node in one spot, and they'll throw it over here, and it means something completely different, and that just adds into the confusion of everything. And so what I recommend, we're going to be holding this session, 4-part session, in January. We're actually going to get a lot more in. If I was to try and go into the depth of what blockchain is in its technical aspects here, one, I'd bore everybody. Two, it would take forever. And so we really wanted to break it down and really adapt what the potential of blockchain is to agriculture, how it fits within the industry, everything from seed to table, because it's fascinating as I've learned more about agriculture, seeds, the fact that a seed, if there's too much heat, that it environmental exposures, it will actually change the overall yield later down the road. And so how do you as a farmer make sure that you're buying the right seed? Can we track and trace all of the information about that seed leading up to you buying it so that you're going to get a good seed and be able to trust it? And that's the big problem. So we'll go way more into the depth of that, how the applications are, and really how to start implementing and working towards helping with the supply chain, because what I've learned significantly working overseas and everything is that nothing great happens unless a lot of people come together to make it.
Okay, thanks. So, I mean, we could talk literally for hours about blockchain and the applications, but we wanted to leave lots of time for questions and answers for this group. So there are a couple of roving microphones, but we'd certainly welcome any questions that you have about some of the concepts that Jefferson's highlighted here and how they might apply to your business. So what questions can we answer for you on
Yes,
blockchain?
I have a question here, and Walmart Foods recently reported that it took 14 days to identify the romaine lettuce and the E. coli. So 14 days they had to clean their stores out, they had to get rid of everything. The cost just went skyrocketing. And they actually reported this at a U.S. Retailer Association of Florida a couple of weeks ago. And it was quite interesting, the feedback they got, from the whole group, just the cost and the timing. My question to you is, we hear all this. This can be put all together. This E. coli situation of food has happened, a couple times over, a number of years. When do you think this will be fully implemented, where you have a system in place that can really track and trace?
That's a great question. What does that look like how does one implement, what does that timeline look like?
What's interesting is Walmart actually is already testing blockchain, but it's not on romaine lettuce, unfortunately. They're doing it on bananas currently, and they've had lots of success, and they've been able to quarantine issues and rotten issues, all sorts of stuff. So what we're going to see is over the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years, all these technologies are really going to come together. But we have to be prepared. You have to start preparing your farm and your agricultural industry as individuals and as groups within the Southern Alberta region to elevate it and to be first early adopters. If you operationally aren't prepared to implement these types of technologies, you're going to be left behind. And I think it's important to note that, and some of you might have been at this a few weeks ago, but Dr. Hughes, who's a food expert, he came and he talked to us and he showed us the trends of how over the next, until 2050, we're looking at double the population in Africa, and with the climate change, we're actually going to see basically an inhospitality to any type of agriculture over there. And the one country in all of the world that's going to be poised with the best conditions to grow is Canada. And we're going to have more migration, but we literally are predicted to be one of the, possibly the biggest and only suppliers of agriculture products to the world.
So if I hear you, I heard 5 years is kind of the time horizon that you see where all of this is going to come together. And the key advice for this group then is really around being ready for it. So what in your mind does that look like? What does someone do to get ready?
Well, first, understanding the concepts in these technologies. Second, looking at your own operations in your farming. What do you currently have that could be automated that maybe isn't automated yet? I'm big on automation and process, and if you can take certain parts of process out that don't need to be there or automate certain situations, do that now. Prepare yourselves to be as ready for it as possible. Get educated on blockchain, understand artificial intelligence, understand some of these things. And you don't have to be an expert, just understand the basic concepts and start working towards building your operations so that you can accept that sooner. Because any type of technology, there's always a bell curve of adoption. And if you can be on that first side as you early adopters, you're going to be much more poised and will even further Southern Alberta as that total world dominator.
Okay. So, I mean, the example that I heard recently is the Alberta Energy Regulator is testing this with oil royalties. So the current process, an oil well produces a certain volume of oil. That record gets filed by the oil company with the government. There's an audit and a follow-up process. And then ultimately, they get an invoice and they make a royalty payment. And that whole process can sometimes take up to 90 days. So what they've done is they've created a blockchain type structure. There are sensors on the well that are trusted and verified. The production is automatically captured. Everyone's agreed to what that process looks like. And basically the royalty payments happen instantaneously as the oil is produced. So that 90-day cycle is basically happening in less than a second. Mm-hmm. So is that the kind of application we're going to see in payments and verification of shipments and things like that?
Yeah, 100%. That same application in the oil industry can be folded right into agriculture, into finance, into all those things. And like I said, there's going to be progression where middlemen will be losing their value. And hopefully nobody in the audience is a middleman. But we have to be prepared for that. And it's in, at least the technology world, it's innovate or die. And we've seen that with the taxi industry. We've seen it with Airbnb and all these new concepts that are coming out that we thought, oh no, nobody would invite you in your house, and then all of a sudden we realized that, yeah, people are willing to have that in, and now it's disrupted the hotel industry. So agriculture, there's been disruptions coming, but I believe that we've only seen the tip of the iceberg there.
Yeah, I think the internet joke goes something like, don't talk to strangers on the internet, and certainly don't get in their cars. And now we use the internet to talk to strangers to get in their cars.
Exactly.
Okay. Great question. Are there other questions on the technologies, the platforms, some of the ideas that Jefferson's talked about? Ms. Claudette.
One of the issues that's currently out there for the agricultural and rural community is that we don't have urban internet. We don't have the speed, we don't have the download power, it isn't there. So how is that going to impact everything that you're talking about?
Well, and that's when I talked about the implementation of 5G network, back, I'm trying to think now, 2008, you wouldn't be able to go very far outside of a city center, and if you went into too much of a rural area, you'd lose power. Like my parents even, they live in Tabor. There's parts of their house, I go in and my cell phone dies. And so we're not necessarily looking at the internet as we talk in the DSL and the wireless and all those things, but using the 5G cellular networks is what's going to give a lot more coverage. And that's where you're going to have these internet devices, these little monitors that are going to be connecting to that network so it can constantly be feeding. Does that make sense?
But as broadband connectivity then becomes increasingly important for rural communities and rural locations to
Big
drive
time.
some of this.
From if you're talking municipality and what your initiatives need to be, you definitely want to look at upgrading infrastructure and technology so that your community can be a part of the future faster than being left 10 years behind.
Okay, perfect. See a question at the back there.
Yeah, quick question. So as you probably know, farmers in Western Canada have absolutely no complaints with railway service currently.
Of course.
But if there was a complaint, is there potential for blockchain to help manage the logistics of outgoing trains and managing car deliveries to elevators?
Sorry, I missed.
So it was around railway capacity, because of course no one in this room has any concerns about railway shipments or railway companies at all. But is blockchain a potential solution for addressing backlogs, addressing shipments, and some of the capacity constraints we see on the railway? Is that a fair summary of your question? Okay.
Yeah, 100%. Because with any bad process, there's always going to be inefficiencies that kind of come into play. And, you got downtime. So we look at that and I've looked at this within technology in the sphere of service industry. So like an HVAC guy, he's doing his repairs, and then he has a 2-hour window before he needs to go somewhere else. Well, there's an inefficiency that happens there where he's got downtime, he's not getting paid. How can I basically make a connection between someone local and get him business quicker? Well, it's the same thing with these transport trains. If you've got inefficiencies, if you've got empty carts or overfilled, and you're showing up and, oh, sorry, everything's full up and we can't actually put that in the rail car right now. The blockchain, again, and I want to stress that blockchain is a foundation with all these other technologies. You will get real-time updates. There'll be information available to you, and if, let's say, you were in a line of truck drivers trying to fill up and there was 3 in front of you and we already knew how much was on each truck and how much room was basically volume. We get into mathematics at that point. It would be able to verify those things and notify the guy that's coming to drop off his load that, hey, you might as well flip around and head back or not come at all. So there will be efficiency increases, and that will be through the convergence of all these technologies.
Okay, thanks. Great question. Other questions? Over the back there.
Hello. How would we be able to certify what's happening in the real world be accurate on the blockchain?
Accurate on which, sorry?
That's accurate on the blockchain. What actually happens in the real world is tied to that, or how can that not be altered?
That's a great question.
Yeah, so the way that it's not altered is, and this gets into the technical sphere of what blockchain is basically you have a whole bunch of files, and they have a limited capacity, and when enough information is recorded on that file, it gets basically validated and closed, and it cannot be altered after that. You can make adjustments later on down the string of blocks to basically, transactionally if you wanted to change it, but it closes off and no one can alter it. It's in the term is immutability. So especially when we decentralize that information, and within the Bitcoin world, you have an entire network of computer systems that are independently verifying all of this information and all have a copy of the ledger, essentially. So from an agricultural standpoint, we'd be able to have public ledgers of everything that's going on, and there would be enough enough people reaching consensus to verify all that information, and you would have confidence in that, because you're also not trusting a single entity. You're trusting a whole group of people that are all basically agreeing that this has been properly recorded.
So it's about having sort of predefined standards, everyone agrees to what it looks like, and then as that data is collected, it's verified against that, or?
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. You can create whatever conditions you'd like. Once you actually record that information, or you authorize, basically bringing in computer algorithms that have predetermined things that they're trying to accomplish or figure out, you can provide those conditions. Very much like the smart contract, you predetermine those conditions up front, and if anything falls outside of there, it would raise red flags. The computer would then analyze it, and then if it came to it, would notify you as an individual, and then you'd have to go and verify it. But that's really not going to happen once these things start to really pick up speed in the technology.
Okay, perfect. On the other side here at the back.
Thank you. Where would we hire programmers that actually know how to program blockchain? Because I haven't found one living, breathing, heart-beating programmer to do this.
They're out there, and what's nice is I've created a partnership, or like a informal partnership with the University of Lethbridge. Their business, the school, Dillon School of Business, has recently implemented blockchain training within some of those things. I've gone in and actually guest taught some of those classes. And then the computer science department is really focusing on this. I think there's actually a comp sci guy here that I'm going to be meeting with after that's going to be working on a project that's applied to the agriculture industry. So that's one of the things that I've been really actively working on, is trying to find the people who know the type of code and then redirect them to be able to code for blockchain. Because the blockchain code, the code that's been used to develop blockchain is a common code that many coders know. They just have to know how to architecturally put and build the blockchain with those code base.
So, I mean, that's a great point in the sense that we are seeing our post-secondary institutions move in that direction to support industry, because it's a bit of a cart and a horse argument. And
we're trying to catch up, and that's one of the biggest issues in the industry right now, is the lack of talent. But within anything, I think people can quickly learn, and especially if they have that fundamental basis of code understanding, we can train them pretty quick.
Okay. I mean, as a Lethbridge person focused on the economy, I can tell you that the information and technology sector of our economy is actually the smallest. It's only about 4.5%, but employment and job growth in that sector is double the rate of everywhere else. So although it's a small part of our economy today, we are seeing rapid growth in jobs, and part of it is as our post-secondary institutions and companies become attuned to those needs. So, other questions?
I don't see anyone just yet, but Trevor, maybe I'll butt in here and, talk a little bit about you mentioned ethics and you backing out of one contract for ethics, and you talk about the 5G network, and of course, we know the headlines now about some 5G partners that are looking a little suspicious or concerned. Where do we balance the need for security and privacy with this very practical approach to sharing information?
This is a tough one.
Sorry,
no. This
my
is really
reporter
good.
Background.
No, because privacy is one of the biggest things, and we think we're protected, and we think that we have these privacy laws in Canada, but there's always breaches. There's those bad people, right? And that's one of the reasons why blockchain, I think, is so fundamentally important to this, is because it decentralizes a lot of that power, and it makes a lot of everything that we're seeing on a daily basis transparent. We can go check it ourselves, we can look at it, and actually be able to have confidence in those things. Because especially from a reporting standpoint, one media says this, the other media says this, and you get all these conflicts and nobody knows what's going on. But that's one of the trends that we're seeing in technology, is more open source, which means essentially, hey, I've created something and I want to share it with everybody. I don't want to just keep it to myself, because I want to further increase the advantage to the whole world globally or collectively rather than individually. You've got big corporations who are now coming together with smaller industry partners, startup companies. IBM's partnered with a ridiculous amount of little blockchain companies to try and bring them all together, and they're sharing information. You've got Elon Musk with his patents in the United States that he opened up for everybody. And so there's very much a trend within that sphere of being more open, honest, and again, blockchain will come in a certain way to allow more confidence and integrity that is brought back into these broken systems.
But then that's counting on countries like China to, where do we factor things like that in national security? Or is there not going to be such a thing as worrying about national secrets in the big picture in the future?
Governments are always going to be trying to protect themselves. I've seen too many of those to know. They'll say that they're up front, we're totally open and honest here, but they always got something in their back pocket. Nationalism, it's a tough thing. Everybody's trying to win, and that's not necessarily what it is. I think it's going to be the generalized consumer, the regular public, that's going to push this trend. We can't necessarily, unfortunately, control the big brother. The other thing that's terrifying in some sense, not to scare anybody, but like quantum computing, if a bad country were to break the quantum first, they could essentially take down the internet in like 0 time. They would crack every single password. Quantum would essentially destroy what we currently look at today as encryption on the internet, the protection and the privacy. But what we see is, though, as quantum does come in, and if it's the right group that actually figures it out first, we can actually use quantum to bolster all of our other information and make it a lot more credible.
Yes, okay. We got another question over here?
Yeah, just to combine a couple other questions that have been brought up. You had mentioned things to prepare for this and about the computer coding. Would you suggest learning about the basics of computer programming and language to help get ready for this? Any language you would specifically suggest learning about?
You got to look at the trends. You've got everything from Ruby on Rails to JavaScript to, like, there's new ones coming up here and there. Some people will use this code, that code. I don't necessarily if you're an agricultural producer, understanding code base won't necessarily benefit you. It's more understanding the basic concepts of how these technologies will operate and preparing yourself, buying the new whizzy tractor that maybe is autonomous, has the geolocation systems, slowly starting to upgrade your operational opportunities, essentially. So really, if you were to dabble in coding, I don't think you'd get a lot from that, simply because up front, I don't code. I'm not a coder. I understand the basic concepts, and then I work and I consult on that level.
Thank you.
Great question, and it's something, honestly, both school divisions here in Lethbridge are talking about. So there is a group in Lethbridge that's met from time to time. We have a Code YQL group, which is a bunch of interesting folks that get together or have gotten together in the past. But we've also run workshops for kids learning code and ladies learning code. And so that both school divisions are trying to figure out, as we look at the future and we think about the importance of the ability to at least understand the principles, that coding elements should be as important as learning to read and write, because it will be a new form of language. And so, there are foundational classes at the elementary level that are in design at this point to ensure kids know how to code and what it looks like and how to use it. So, there is work being done there, but certainly lots more to happen, I think.
Yeah, like understanding the basic tenets of code, I think, is important. I tell my kids all the time, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they'll label things, and I say, well, why don't you that'll be kind of like your focus, but focus on data. Data is the future. Data will drive everything.
But then it also sounds like it's better to be a primary producer than a middleman, because it sounds like the future for the middleman isn't.
That's what we're kind of seeing in blockchain overall. The financial institution, that's why the banks are terrified, because they've been able to pigeonhole themselves between consumers and service providers for so long, or doing our own simplified banking. So you're seeing basically an automation system, and a lot of people freak out and they're like, but it's taking our jobs and everything's terrible. But these jobs, basically, they just transfer over into a new industry. There will be more jobs created, and that's why I do tell my kids, learn code, learn data, understand these tenets, because you will be more valuable to anyone, and you literally could go into any field at that point.
Okay, I guess we'll give one last call for questions. Did you want to do any wrap-up thoughts?
No, I just wanted to say, thanks for your time today. We know we're sort of standing between you and a world record that Ken's got planned here, so we want to let that happen. But Jefferson and I will both be around for a little bit. If you have questions, if you'd like to talk some more, happy to do that, and then reach out to either of us. We're happy to talk some more and share kind of what we're working on. But really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and at least give you a preview of some things that are happening and what's going on even in our own community. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you that's right. Let's give them a hand for opening our eyes and helping us glance into the future. Thank you. And letting us know that the future is right here and right here in our own community. So we really appreciate it. Thank you.